What a difference a year makes. In terms of access to abortion, this is what the state of Texas looked like last August. There were 40 clinics evenly distributed across the state to serve the 5.4 million women of reproductive age. Okay, so that is what Texas looked like about a year ago. And this is what Texas looks like today. It has only 8 clinics left, and if you look at this map, you will see that most of the state, most of it is without abortion access. And in the poorest parts of Texas, along the Mexico border, there are no clinics. Why is this happening? Because last summer, Texas Governor Rick Perry signed into law some of the strictest abortion restrictions in the nation. And yesterday, that law, which has already resulted in the closing of over a third of the state's abortion clinics, that law went into full effect when a federal appeals court ruled that there was insufficient evidence that a large fraction of women seeking abortions in Texas would face unconstitutional burden due to the clinic closings. Let's go back to that map for a second, because that map, to me, looks very much like a large fraction of the state without access to abortion services. In fact, these clinic closings, the ones that have been happening throughout the year and then again dramatically overnight, those closings mean that nearly 1 million women in Texas will have to drive for more than 3 hours to get to an abortion clinic. But apparently, for the 3 judges on the 5th Circuit of Appeals in New Orleans, that does not constitute an undue burden. Joining me now is the president of NARAL Pro-Choice America, Ilyse Hogue. Ilyse, thanks for joining me. Do you think this constitutes a health crisis?
Look, I absolutely do. My poor home state of Texas is getting hit every which way these days. I think there's 3 things we need to take away from what's happened over the last 24 hours. First, any idea that this is being done in service of women's health has just been blown out of the water. It is not in service of women's health to close clinics overnight, cancel appointments for necessary medical procedures, and otherwise force women into desperate situations when we know that that's exactly what happens. When abortion is inaccessible or illegal, the number of abortions do not go down, the number of deaths go up. The second thing is we've got a real problem with our judiciary.
Yeah.
This is the same circuit court that actually overruled Judge Yackel in the last Texas case. We've seen over the last decades activist judges that were put in place by conservative presidents putting their ideology, particularly around abortion, ahead of the constitutional rule of law, and that's unacceptable. It has to stop. And finally, I want your viewers to remember one name, Vincent Rue. This is the expert that was widely mocked after the hearing in Texas as having absolutely no medical credentials to be putting forward anything in service of women's health. It is on his testimony that the circuit court upheld their ruling. This guy has been debunked. He is not a medical expert. He has faulty science, and he travels from state to state to pursue an ideological agenda that is not about women's health. It's about controlling women, and his goal is to outlaw abortion all over this country.
Vincent has been very successful in making his cooked-up case, given the fact that abortion, women are 40 times more likely to die of a colonoscopy than an abortion.
Right.
In terms of safetyness, this is on par with a dental extraction or perhaps a biopsy or a vasectomy. So the notion that clinics need to meet ambulatory surgical requirements is effectively an excuse to close a lot of abortion clinics across the state of Texas. I guess, Ilyse, you know, from your understanding of the women out there who need these services, who is this law going to affect the most?
I mean, it's absolutely rural women, low-income women, poor women. Always, even pre-Roe, women of means have had access through private providers or getting on a plane and flying to Europe to access all medical services they need, especially abortion. In my home state of Texas, the women that are furthest away from the clinics, the ones who are going to suffer, are minimum wage workers who don't get paid for the days of work that they don't show up, have to shell out more money for child care if they are already mothers, transportation costs, hotels. It's not only an undue burden, it's actually oppression of the most vulnerable women in our country.
Let me ask you, Ilyse, it is also a disturbing case it's a disturbing case on so many levels. It's hard to talk about all of them in one segment. In terms of the sort of precedent it sets legally, Jeffrey Toobin talks about the increasingly narrow definition of undue burden. I mean, the definition is getting so narrow that it may be invisible. He writes, the members of the Fifth Circuit seem to believe that anything short of a nationwide ban on abortion does not amount to an undue burden on women's rights. This is the argument that will soon be heading to the Supreme Court. I mean, clearly, 1.3 million women in Texas live more than 100 miles from a clinic, and yet that is not considered undue burden. One can imagine if 1.3 million men lived, 100 miles from a clinic where they were having, I don't know, vasectomies or some other important reproductive related surgery, there would be no question about whether that was a burden or not.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think everyone from Rick Perry wannabe Greg Abbott to the Rights Life organizations that have been singularly focused on their goal of making abortion completely inaccessible and ultimately illegal as the law of our land, have shown that they don't care about the burden on women generally, the burden on poor women specifically. What they care about is legislating their morality and ideology on the rest of us, and that's fundamentally un-American.
Ilyse, in terms of the midterms, I mean, we know Texas is the site of a heated battle between Greg Abbott and Wendy Davis. Wendy Davis made her name nationally resisting this very bill, or at the time it was a bill. Politically speaking, do you think that she's now behind by almost, I believe, double digits in her race for governor? Do you think this helps? Do you think this wakes women in Texas up to realize the stakes at hand in November?
Well, actually, the latest poll shows her within single digits of Greg Abbott.
I stand corrected.
And I think it does. I really think it does. I mean, Wendy understands the real life of women all over Texas. And by the way, this is not just a women's issue. There are more and more men who are waking up and understanding that this is not only a health care crisis that affects their wives, their mothers, their daughters, their sisters, but this is a fundamental question of whether they get to decide what's best for their families, or whether politicians in a state house or judges in a circuit court far away get to decide. And more Texans across the board are saying that's unacceptable. This is not what we elect politicians to do, and I think they're going to turn out for Wendy.
It is worth noting 56% of American women now live in a state where abortion rights have been restricted. This is a family planning issue. President of NARAL Pro-Choice America, Ilyse Hogue, it is always good to see you. Thanks for your time, Ilyse.
Thank you, Alex.
Coming up more